Start the book of Exodus.
Amen.
Amen. So we're moving right along through the season. By now, those of you that have been with us for a while know how the cycle progresses, and one week just builds on the other. As we had just finished, well, we're just now finishing the last episode, but we finished the story of Joseph. All right, we've been spending 3, 4, 5 weeks, 4 weeks probably, on Joseph. One of the longest studies of the Torah that we have, because there's, like I said before, there's some 13 or 14 chapters of the book of Genesis. Almost 25% of the book of Genesis is on Joseph. So it's obviously a very important character, obviously a very important patriarch that we should be looking toward to learn from. I'll talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where that's the blessing line, the line of blessing where it gets established. But Joseph, they spend a lot of time talking about Joseph because he's a symbol of Messiah.
That's right.
He's an archetype of the Messiah. And there's much that we can learn about the restoration of Israel from the story of Joseph. We went through, if you've been reading this and you've been following it, if you just sit down and start reading the story of Joseph from the time that Jacob gives him his multicolored tunic, or till the time that we end up right here, till the end of the Genesis, you will find an incredibly emotional, an incredibly intense sequence of events that took place. And as you study it, you see the ramifications of it in the future. You know, Joseph was a dreamer, and we see the fruition of his dreams in the last episode, when he finally reveals himself to his brothers. And we see that as an end time projection, as an end time prophecy, as an example of what is going to happen, maybe even in our days, between Joseph and Judah, once again, where Judah is going to finally recognize Joseph, and Joseph is finally going to reveal himself to Judah as the restoration takes place in Messiah Yeshua. It's one of those elements of end-time prophecy or eschatology that a lot of the teachers overlook because they're looking at it from a different perspective. They're not looking at it from an Israel perspective. They're looking at it from a modern-day church perspective. But the Bible is not about church. The Bible is about Israel. And when you start looking at it from that standpoint, and you see that all these prophecies about the restoration of the whole house of Israel, they all have to come true. Otherwise, they're not prophecies. All right? So they all have to come true. It's not only in Ezekiel, but it's in Joel, it's in Micah, it's in different prophets that say that this is going to happen. And it's going to happen in the future. I would pray, I feel that it's happening in our time. And I would pray that it gets stronger and stronger in our time. And if it doesn't happen in my generation or in my time, then I pray that it happens in my son's time or his son's time. But it's going to happen because God's word is true.
That's right.
Amen. All right? So we find here, we pick up the story of Israel as Joseph's life is terminating. And we start off, it says this is the book of names, this is Shemot, because it says these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. And it gets down to this point where it says all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And then it says Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation died also. There's one statement here that says Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. And we were midrashing over this today, and we were saying, well, who does that really mean? It means Joseph, it means his brothers, and those of his generation. Now, not all of us are of the same generation, are we? You know, Mark and I are of the same generation. and a few others of you and I are all of the same generation, born during a certain time period. They call that the generation, right? But my son is not of my generation. He's of his own generation, all right? He's my son. So if we're reading this, we're looking at it and saying, well, who that we know of during this time would still be living that were not of Joseph's generation? They were not his brothers or not his generation. His children, right?
That's right.
So his children would be not of his generation. So Ephraim and Manasseh would probably still be alive, and their sons would still be alive. So there were those that when Joseph died that still went on living, that knew Joseph, that knew the things that God had done through Joseph. And there were many, many more that were around, right? Because as Joseph was alive, as his brothers were alive, their wives were having children. You know, they were all having big families and children. And we read here in this passage that in verse 7 that the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. I kind of like what Kirill read in his translation. He says the sons of Israel were fertile and filled the area. Fertile and filled the area. There is some thought from the rabbis, from the commentaries, that when Israel was when they were having children in Goshen, that they were so fertile and they were so fruitful that they were having triplets and quadruplets and that kind of thing, and the population was just expanding kind of geometrically. That's why it says that there were so many of them. They became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. It doesn't say Goshen was filled with them. It says the land was filled with them. Okay. So these guys that existed past the time of Joseph would remember Joseph, and they would be passing their information on to their children and their children's children, just like anything else. Sitting around the fire, since they didn't have Xbox and Wii at the time, they'd be sitting around the fire and talking to one another, which is really a unique thing to happen these days. Just to kind of sit around and talk and to midrash about what the Lord is doing in your life, and it's almost like if you sit down to talk to somebody about what God is doing, immediately they say, excuse me a minute, I gotta go to the bathroom. Or how's the weather doing, you know? Or talk about what the magic is doing, and they'll be more than happy to talk to you. But to talk about what God is doing, you know, in your life and in the lives of others, it's kind of the exception to the rule. Maybe in your own family you find it very easy to do that, but it's kind of the exception. Let's face it. You know, kind of I know if you're in, for men, let me talk from a guy's standpoint. From a men's standpoint, if I'm in a group of men that I kind of know, but maybe not from here, but just associates or sort of acquaintances or something, and I start talking about, you know, how Yeshua was blessing me and what Yeshua did and how Yeshua said this and Yeshua said that, you know, immediately the crowd thins out. Yep. Or the conversation just kind of goes out and goes, boom. And then you got to talk about cars or football or basketball or weather or what are you going to eat, you know, things that are really, you know, not that important. But in the times of the patriarchs, they're sitting around the tent, they're sitting around the campfire, they're family, they're talking, they're telling stories. Is there anybody in here who's a good storyteller? That you think you're a good storyteller? It's a lost art. It's almost an art form now. You know, where fathers and friends used to sit down and they'd tell stories. You know? It didn't matter that they're true, they're entertaining. You know, but they're good storytellers. But they would tell these stories and they would pass them on from one another. Remember when we studied the generations from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, and how long these guys lived? Adam lived almost to the times of Noah, didn't he? Well, what did Adam have to talk about? Huh? All he had to talk about was God. All he had to talk about was pass on to his sons and daughters. You know, these are the things that happened to me. This is what it was like in the garden, you know, kind of thing. You know, Abraham was the same way. passing this stuff on, passing on the promises of God, passing on, that's why they said what they said about it. So I would imagine the same thing would have happened with Joseph. That his descendants would have been passing on. Gosh, you wouldn't believe what happened, and how dad's brothers came down, and how my grandfather came down, and all these guys came down into Egypt, and what they had to go through, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. If you've ever sat down and talked to your grandparents, if you ever had the opportunity to talk to your grandparents, they had some incredible stories. Some of them have stories of survival. Some of them have stories that, gosh, how did you survive? How did you do that? And some of them are extremely interesting, what they've gone through. I can't imagine. Here's a man that Yvonne's father that lived almost 94 years. That's almost a whole 100 years old almost.
Yeah, some awesome stories.
I mean, can he tell you some stories about 1925? That you don't know about? What it was like and all those kinds of things. And they can see the signs of what's going on, and it might trigger, I remember this happened back in 1938. Or I can remember this when this happened. They're living history. Living history. So I'm saying all this, and I'm going through all this, because we don't know what the period of time is in here between the time that Joseph died and the time that a new Pharaoh came into existence. Maybe somebody does. If you do, I don't know what it is. But there was a period of time there, while Joseph, it doesn't talk about the death of the previous Pharaoh, it just talks about the death of Joseph. Joseph was 127 years old when he died. How much time did he spend in the land in Egypt? Of that 127 years? About 100. About 100 years. Don't you think you would have established some kind of a testimony in 100 years?
Yeah.
Now, why am I doing all this? Because the very next verse says that a Pharaoh came into existence that didn't know Joseph.
Right.
Yeah, right. How could you not know Joseph? How could you not know? I'll tell you how you could not know Joseph. Go back to the time of Abraham. Go back to Genesis chapter, I think it's in 22. And let's look at Abraham and Isaac. And we won't go through the whole story, but it's the Akedah, or the Akedah. It is the binding of Isaac. All right? When God tells Abraham to go take your son, your only son, the one that you love. All right? Trying to make sure Abraham didn't get confused between him and Ishmael. And take him to make an offering of him in the place where I show you, on Mount Moriah. All right, so he's there. Everything is ready to go. And in verse 10 of chapter 22, it says, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. It's kind of a twist here in this verse. It says, an angel of the Lord said to him, and he said, don't do this to your son. And then he says, now I know, because you have not withheld your son from me. So it's got to be the Lord speaking. The word here that I want you to look at is I know. The word know. K-N-O-W. The word there is yada, or a variation of yada. It's a root. The root is yada, which means to know in Hebrew. But it doesn't mean to know as intellectually. Bill knows me, and I know Bill, but he doesn't know me like my son David knows me. He doesn't know me like my wife knows me. but he knows me. Right? This word yada entails an experience that you have had together. Something more than just knowledge. We all in here, we all know each other. Or you all, let me put it this way, you all know me. But do you really know me? And how would you really know me? Rather than in passing.